Thank you, Mahir. Is this working? Great. Good evening. It's a delight to be here, although I share my colleagues' nervousness, because this is a different sort of format that we're used to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn our attention to the part of the world that often gets neglected in discussions of forced migration and is often left outside some of the protections that we've been hearing about for refugees and asylum seekers, and that's the Americas. My original idea for this talk was actually to convey a sense of urgency about migration in the Americas by painting a dystopian picture of the future. But the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize the future is now. So before we imagine 2030, let's take a look at where we are today and why it's so disturbing. So I see three broad changes that are intersecting to create a rather dystopian present. One of these changes is a serious crackdown on immigration in the United States. Since the 1990s, the US government has fortified the border, invested billions of dollars in personnel and technology, and raided homes and workplaces to deport longtime residents. It has also made access to asylum more difficult and effectively outsourced a lot of immigration control to Mexico, which is now detaining and deporting thousands of migrants before they get anywhere near the US border. At first glance, it actually appears like these policies are working. Border crossings are at their lowest level since the 1970s, and the number of Mexican immigrants in the United States has been declining since the mid-2000s. Clearly, we do not need more walls or troops at the border. But even at their current levels, I argue that these policies do more harm than good because they actually make us less rather than more secure. Not only do they exact a terrible toll on the migrants themselves, but they play directly into the hands of organized crime. No longer able to cross safely on their own or with the help of a small-time local smuggler, migrants are being drawn into complex webs of human smugglers, drug traffickers, and corrupt officials for whom smuggling has become a multi-billion-dollar business. Every time a border closes, a criminal gets a raise. And yet, even after paying ever higher fees for safe passage, migrants are regularly killed, kidnapped, raped, and extorted. According to Mexican organizations, some 47,000 migrants lost their lives in Mexico between 2007 and 2013, and some 20,000 go missing every year. At least a third of women and girls are sexually abused along the route. So the future is now, but it could get even worse. This vicious cycle between increased enforcement, shifting migrant routes, and worsening security is likely to spread as it intersects with another in the second major change in the region, which is the explosion of forced migration. I mean, migrants have always sought to feed their families, but today's migrants are truly desperate. Many of them are fleeing astronomical levels of violence in Central America's Northern Triangle, caused by a toxic mix of poverty, gangs, impunity, and legacies of civil war. Others are trying to escape a complete economic disaster in Venezuela, where food shortages are rampant, the healthcare system is collapsing, and children are dying of malnutrition. We've been hearing a lot about the migrant caravan traveling through Mexico, but an even bigger story is the exodus of Venezuelans. In the last 2 years, an estimated 4 million people have left the country, only about half of whom are registered abroad. At this rate, they could surpass the number of Syrian refugees. So the future is now, but it could get even worse. If the newly elected president of Brazil keeps his promise to unleash development in the Amazonian rainforest, the UN's dire predictions about climate change could come true even sooner than expected. If so, we will see even more people displaced by hurricanes, floods, and drought, particularly in the Caribbean, Central America, and Mexico. And these people are likely to end up in some of the same communities that are already struggling to absorb the migrants of today. Which brings me to the third major change in the region, the influx of people into countries that are more accustomed to sending migrants than to receiving them. At the top of this list are Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil. these 5 countries are hosting most of the region's new migrants, and yet they are woefully unprepared to meet their needs as they crowd into overtaxed migrant shelters and informal settlements with little access to services, education, and healthcare. In many places, civil society is coming to the rescue, but it can only do so much in countries that lack resources, have very weak rule of law, and struggle with their own problems of violence and corruption. So the future is now, but one more time, it could get even worse. As local communities feel these pressures with the displacement that is occurring, residents are going to lose patience, fueling anti-immigrant backlash and the rise of xenophobic parties and politicians. And once these politicians start winning elections, they're likely to overturn the region's relatively flexible and rights-based immigration laws. In so doing, they will further reinforce this vicious cycle of crackdown, crime, and displacement. Fragile democracies will become increasingly authoritarian, and forced migration will spread. Obviously, the best way to reverse these terrible trends are, one, to slow climate change, but even more importantly, to resolve the crises in Central America and Venezuela. The former is primarily a question of political will, but the latter requires complex, deep changes that will take decades at least. But there is one thing we can do right away, and that is try to protect and strengthen the few rays of light in this dark story, namely decent legal frameworks, mostly welcoming publics, and the relative absence of anti-immigrant rhetoric by opportunistic politicians south of the US border. This will require political leadership and regional solutions in Latin America, and strong support from the international community, including funding. And of course, the US could play a major positive role, but only with a fundamental shift in our own immigration and climate policies. None of this is likely to happen without public pressure, whether in the streets or at the ballot box. Fortunately, most countries in the region are democracies, including the United States, leaving a window of opportunity to chart a different path to 2030 before it's too late. So we can still make the future something better than now. Thank you.